It's on every dinner table on the planet. From your local greasy spoon to the fanciest restaurant in Paris, it's just there. It's the first thing a chef reaches for, and the last thing we think about. A simple, cheap, crystalline rock that we sprinkle on our food without a second thought. We call it salt. And here's the thing, we think of it as a seasoning, but that's like calling gold a nice material for jewelry. It completely misses the point. Because the truth is, salt is not a food. It's a biological necessity. You literally cannot live without it. Your nerves don't fire, your muscles don't contract, your heart doesn't beat. Without salt, you die. And that makes it the most powerful substance in human history. This isn't a story about flavor. This is a story about power. It's a story of how controlling the supply of this one simple mineral allowed empires to rise, armies to march, and revolutions to begin. The history of salt is a brutal, staggering story of monopoly, warfare, and imperial control. The word salary that comes from salt. The word soldier that comes from salt too. So go ahead and grab your favorite salty snack. Settle in and get ready for the hidden history of the world's most humble and most violent ingredient. The story of salt. So, did you grab that salty snack? A bag of chips, maybe some pretzels. Whatever it is, you're probably thinking about the little white crystals sprinkled on top. The salt you can see. But here's the thing, that's not where the real salt is. The salt shaker on your kitchen table, the salt you add when you're cooking, that accounts for maybe 10% of the salt you eat. The rest of it, it's completely invisible. It's the salt that's already been added to literally everything you buy. It's in your bread, your breakfast cereal, your salad dressing, the can of soup in your pantry, the frozen pizza, the deli meat. It's hidden in almost every single packaged and processed food on the planet. And the scale of this is just, well, it's staggering. Globally, we are pulling around 300 million tons of salt out of the earth every single year. For perspective, that's more than double the weight of every new car manufactured on the entire planet, annually. It has become the most ubiquitous industrial chemical in the world. And of course, a massive chunk of that ends up in our food. In America, the average person eats about 3,400 milligrams of sodium a day, which is almost 50% more than what doctors recommend. And again, nearly all of that comes from a factory, not a salt shaker. This has, predictably, created a public health firestorm. A decades-long war on salt, pitting doctors against food companies in a battle over hypertension, heart disease, and what it means to eat a healthy diet. It's the latest and maybe most complicated chapter in our relationship with this mineral. But before we get into the modern controversy, we have to understand how we got here. How did this simple, life-giving rock become the most powerful and fought-over substance in human history? To answer that, we need to go back, way back, to a time when a pinch of salt wasn't a health risk, but the difference between life and death. All right, so let's journey back. Before empires, before cities, before we even figured out how to grow our own food. We need to go back to the very dawn of humanity, to a time when our ancestors were just one of many creatures trying not to get eaten. And here's the first thing to understand. That biological need for salt we talked about. It's not just us. Every land animal on Earth needs it. Your dog needs it. The deer in the forest needs it. The elephant on the savannah needs it. But there's a problem. Plants don't really contain much salt. So if you're an herbivore, you have a massive life-threatening mineral deficiency. And for our earliest ancestors, this was the first clue. They watched animals. They learned their habits. And they would have seen something strange. They'd see herds of deer or mammoths traveling for miles, sometimes through dangerous territory, all heading to the same spot, a place where they would get on their knees and lick the ground, or a strange-looking rock for hours. So, Being the curious apes that we are, we followed them, and what we found must have looked like magic. It could have been an exposed salt dome, a dried-up ancient seabed, or a salty spring bubbling up from the earth. We tasted it. And that powerful savoury flavour wasn't just a treat. It was a signal, hardwired into our brains, telling us, this is something you need. This is life. But for a long, long time, that's all it was. A supplement. Because for hunter-gatherers, getting enough salt wasn't a huge problem. They were eating a ton of meat. And fresh meat and blood are naturally full of the salt and minerals you need to survive. The real problem wasn't finding salt. It was finding food. Every day was a race against time, a desperate hunt for calories before the sun went down. And then, probably by complete accident, came the breakthrough. Maybe a piece of fish was left in a tidal pool that evaporated in the sun, leaving it caked in salt. Or maybe some meat from a hunt was stored in a cave near a natural salt deposit. A few days later, someone finds it, and it hasn't rotted. It hasn't turned. It's still good. In fact, it's delicious. This was the single most important discovery in prehistory, more important than the sharpest spear or the warmest fire. Suddenly, food wasn't a fleeting thing you had to eat immediately. You could store it. The bounty of a huge kill could last for weeks or even months. You could survive a brutal winter. You could build up a surplus. And if you could store food, you could travel. You could pack up preserved meat and fish and journey into the unknown, over mountains and across seas, confident that you wouldn't starve. This was the invention of food security. It was the technology that allowed our ancestors to leave Africa and populate the entire globe. This wasn't just about flavor anymore. This was about power over nature itself. The power to cheat starvation and conquer new lands. And as soon as humans figured out that this simple white rock gave them that power, they realized it was the most valuable thing on Earth. It was worth protecting, it was worth fighting for, and it was worth controlling. Alright, so how do you go from occasionally finding a magical rock to controlling the world's supply of it? How does salt make the leap from a lucky find to something you can build a society on? And this is where the story takes a massive turn. Because right around the time we discover salt's power as a preservative, we are also making another, even bigger discovery. We're figuring out how to farm. The agricultural revolution sweeps across the globe, and for the first time, humans are settling down, building villages and growing grains like wheat and rice. But here's the problem. A diet of grains is a diet with almost zero salt. Unlike a hunter-gatherer's diet of fresh meat, a farming diet is a one-way ticket to a fatal mineral deficiency. Suddenly, that salt lick that was a nice supplement is now a non-negotiable, life or death necessity for an entire stationary population. So, you have a society that is completely dependent on a steady supply of salt and not enough natural sources to go around. What do? Well, you don't find it, you make it. And this single shift, from gathering to producing, changes everything. Which brings us to a small, unremarkable valley in what is now Austria, around 7,000 years ago. This is the very beginning of the Bronze Age. And here, in a place that will one day be called Hallstatt, we find the world's first salt mine. And this wasn't just a couple of guys with shovels. This was an industrial operation. Using bronze and antler pickaxes, these early miners dug complex shafts hundreds of meters deep into a solid mountain of salt. It was dangerous, backbreaking work, deep in the cold, dark earth. In fact, the salt preserved their bodies and their tools so perfectly that in the 1800s, miners would stumble upon the tattooed corpse of a man who had died in a cave-in thousands of years earlier. And why did they take such insane risks? Because it made them powerful. The people of Hallstatt became fantastically, ridiculously rich. Archaeologists digging through their graves have found artifacts from all over the ancient world. Amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, wine from Greece. All of it paid for with salt. The Celtic word for salt was hall, and Hallstatt literally means place of salt. It was Europe's first industrial centre, and its wealth was legendary. And what's crazy is that halfway across the world, at almost the exact same time, a completely different group of people were having the exact same idea. Now, over in China, they didn't have a mountain made of pure salt. What they did have were massive underground lakes of salt water, ancient brine trapped deep below the surface. And so, around 4,000 years ago, engineers in the Sichuan Basin developed a technology that is just, honestly, astonishing. They invented deep drilling. Using massive bamboo derricks, they drilled boreholes over 100 meters deep to reach the brine. But here's the genius part. They would pipe the natural gas that came up with the brine and use it to heat the vats, boiling off the water and leaving behind pure, crystalline salt. It was the world's first integrated industrial process, using one natural resource to process another. And right away, the local rulers realized what they had. This wasn't just a resource, it was a weapon. The ability to produce huge quantities of salt gave them a captive market. Everyone needed it, and they were the only ones who had it. And it marks the very first time in history that a government creates a state monopoly on an essential good. This is the moment salt goes from being a mineral to being a commodity, something that can be manufactured, quantified, taxed, and fought over. And once you can mass produce salt, you need a way to move it. You need roads. You need armies to protect those roads. You need a system of currency to pay those armies. And suddenly, this simple, humble mineral is laying the foundation for the world's first empires. So, what happens when a simple mineral stops being just a seasoning or a preservative and becomes the absolute foundation of your civilization? Well, it becomes something more. It goes beyond the practical and takes on a symbolic, even spiritual power. It becomes sacred, and nowhere was this more true than in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians, of course, were obsessed with the afterlife, and preserving the physical body for that journey was step number one. The key to that whole process: salt. They would harvest a substance called natron from the dry lake beds of the Nile Valley, basically a naturally occurring cocktail of salt and baking soda. And they used it for everything. It was a ritual purifier for cleansing temples and sacred objects. But its most famous use was in mummification. For 40 days, a body would be packed in piles of natron, which would pull every last drop of moisture out, preserving the flesh and stopping decay completely. They were literally pickling their pharaohs for eternity, using the exact same principle that let our ancestors store fish through the winter. But while the Egyptians used salt to prepare for the next world, a new power was rising that would use it to conquer this one. Which brings us to Rome. Rome's power wasn't built on gigantic pyramids. It was built on its legions, and armies, as they say, march on their stomachs. So, how do you feed hundreds of thousands of soldiers on a brutal campaign, months away from the nearest farm? You need preserved, non-perishable food. You need cured meats and salted fish. You need salt, a lot of it. It was the strategic fuel of the Roman war machine. In fact, it was so fundamental that Roman soldiers were often paid, at least in part, with a ration of this essential mineral. This payment was known as the salarium argentum. And that word, salarium, is the direct root of a word we all know very, very well: salary. That's right. The concept of being paid a salary for your work comes from Roman soldiers getting paid in salt. This is also, by the way, very likely where we get the expression worth his salt. A good soldier was literally worth his payment in salt. It wasn't just a seasoning, it was currency. Cold, hard, crystalline cash. And as soon as salt becomes the basis for money and the engine of war, well, it's no longer something you just happen to find. It's now something you control, something you tax, and something you are absolutely willing to kill for. So, in Rome, salt is becoming money. It's the stuff you use to pay your soldiers. But while the Romans were figuring out how to turn salt into a salary, the Chinese were taking it to a completely different level. They weren't just thinking about paying an army, they were thinking about owning the country. Which brings us back to China, around the 3rd century BC. Remember that incredible deep drilling technology from Sichuan? That ability to mass produce pure, crystalline salt? Well, the local lords had already figured out that controlling it made them rich. But now, a new power was rising. The Qin dynasty had just conquered all its rivals, unifying China for the very first time. And the first emperor had a problem, a massive problem. How do you pay for it all? How do you fund a colossal army to guard your new borders? How do you finance a project as insane as a Great Wall stretching for thousands of miles? You can tax land, you can tax crops, but that's complicated, and people can cheat. So you look for something else. Something that every single person, from the poorest farmer to the richest lord, absolutely has to buy, no matter the cost. And that's when they had the idea, a jaw-droppingly simple and utterly brutal stroke of genius. They nationalized the salt industry. Just like that, the imperial government seized control of every major salt flat and every brine well in the entire empire. Private production became illegal, punishable by death. From now on, if you wanted the one mineral you literally needed to stay alive, you had to buy it from the government, at whatever price the government decided to charge. It was the perfect tax. And it made the Chinese empire fantastically, unimaginably wealthy. The profits from the salt monopoly, or the gabelle as it came to be known, would become the primary source of state revenue for the next 2,000 years. It built the Great Wall. It paid for the Grand Canal. It fueled an imperial machine bigger than anything the world had ever seen. But it was so much more than just a source of cash. It was the ultimate instrument of social control. If a province started getting rebellious, you could just cut off their salt supply and starve them into submission. If you needed to fund a sudden war, you just jacked up the price. It gave the emperor a direct lever into the life of every single citizen. And for 2 millennia, dynasty after dynasty, from the Han to the Tang to the Ming, would depend on this system. But when you build your power on a monopoly over something people can't live without, you're also creating a massive vulnerability. Because sooner or later, people are going to get tired of being squeezed. And that's when salt stops being a tool for control and becomes a reason for revolution. Now, while the Chinese emperor was building this massive top-down state monopoly to control a continent, a completely different kind of empire was figuring out how to do the exact same thing, not on land, but on the water. And this brings us to one of the most improbable cities in history, Venice. I want you to picture it, a city built on wooden stilts in the middle of a salty marsh. It has no farms, it has no mines, it has literally no natural resources to speak of. So how does a city like that become the richest, most powerful state in all of Europe for half a millennium? The answer, of course, was salt. The Venetians were sailors and merchants, and they realized something brilliant. You don't have to make the thing to get rich off of it. You just have to be the one who sells it. They saw the vast natural salt pans of the Mediterranean, in Egypt, in Cyprus, across the North African coast. And they saw the landlocked markets of Central Europe, desperate for a way to preserve food through the winter. And they decided to become the critical and only middleman. And when I say middleman, what I really mean is they created a protection racket on an international scale. Their strategy was shrewd and utterly ruthless. The Venetian navy, which doubled as its merchant fleet, would sail to the salt pans, buy up the entire supply, and ship it back to Venice. From there, it would be sold at an enormous markup to traders from Germany and Austria who had no other choice. Because if anyone else tried to get in on their business, well, that's what the war fleet was for. If a merchant ship from their great rival Genoa was caught carrying salt in the Adriatic, it would be attacked and sunk without a second thought. They fought literal wars over this stuff, a century of bloody conflict just to ensure that they, and only they, controlled the flow of salt into Europe. Internally, the Venetian state, the Republic, nationalized the trade completely. It was their own version of the Chinese gabelle, a salt tax that became the bedrock of their economy. And the profits were just, well, they were staggering. This ocean of cash, built grain by grain, funded everything. It paid for the fleets that dominated the Mediterranean. It built the incredible palaces and golden churches that still stand today. The entire, shimmering, impossible city of Venice was a monument to the power of cornering the market on a simple white rock. For centuries, it was the perfect system. A complete chokehold on Europe's most vital commodity. But Venice's entire empire of salt rested on one single, fragile assumption: that the world was small and that all sea lanes led through them. And that was about to change, drastically. So, Venice had built an entire empire on a single chokehold, on the idea that if you wanted salt, you had to go through them. But what happens when the rest of the world decides to just go around? And that, of course, is exactly what was about to happen. Because while Venice was dominating the Mediterranean, a new generation of sailors in Portugal and Spain were getting restless. They were dreaming of a way to bypass the Venetians, to bypass the Ottomans, and find their own direct route to the riches of the East. But here's the problem. Those voyages would be long, insanely long. We're talking months, maybe even years, sailing into a complete unknown, with no chance to resupply. So how do you feed a crew for that long? You need a food source that's cheap, packed with protein, and basically never goes bad. And the answer would come not from the warm Mediterranean, but from the cold, violent waters of the North Atlantic. For centuries, Basque and Viking fishermen had been pulling a fish out of the sea called cod. It's a huge, meaty fish, but here's the crucial part. It has almost no fat. And low fat means it's incredibly easy to preserve. You could salt it, dry it, until it was hard as a wooden plank, and it would last. Not for weeks, for years. To eat it, you just soaked it in water, and it would rehydrate into a perfectly edible meal. It was, quite literally, the perfect fuel for exploration. It was the 15th century equivalent of an MRE. So when a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus went looking for a backdoor to Asia, and when John Cabot sailed from England to what would become Canada, what do you think their ships were loaded with? Barrels and barrels of salted cod. This wasn't some minor detail of the ship's manifest. This was the critical enabler, the power to preserve food with salt, a technology that was thousands of years old, had just been weaponized in a new way. Salted cod was the logistical technology that made the age of exploration possible. Without it, those long, terrifying voyages into the open ocean would have been suicide. The same mineral that paid Roman soldiers and built Venetian palaces was now feeding the sailors who would redraw the map of the world. And in doing so, it would help create a new generation of empires centered not on the seas of the old world, but on the vast open oceans of the new one. All right, so we've seen how nations could build empires by cornering the market on salt. China did it with a state monopoly. Venice did it with a naval protection racket. But nobody, and I mean nobody, managed to turn the salt tax into an instrument of such pure, systemic misery as the French monarchy. And for that, we need to talk about the gabelle. Remember that word? We mentioned it back in China. It was their term for the state monopoly on salt. Well, in France, that word would become a curse. It would become the most hated word in the entire kingdom, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old regime. And here's why. The French gabelle wasn't just a tax. It was a masterpiece of institutional cruelty. It wasn't a percentage you paid on a purchase. No, that would be too simple. Instead, the government forced every single person over the age of 8 to buy a minimum amount of salt each year, the sel du devoir, or salt of duty, and you had to buy it directly from the state, at a price the state completely invented. But here's where it goes from simple extortion to something truly insane. The price wasn't the same everywhere. The kingdom was divided into 6 different regions, each with its own wildly different price for salt. In some areas, the tax was relatively low. In others, it was jaw-droppingly high, as much as 50 or 60 times what the salt was actually worth. This meant a family in one province might pay a fortune for the exact same substance that a family a few miles away could get for almost nothing. Naturally, this created a massive black market, an entire underground economy run by salt smugglers, the faux sauniers, who would risk everything to move cheap salt into the highly taxed zones. And the state's response? They created a special, heavily armed police force, the Gabelus, who were despised and feared everywhere they went. They had the right to enter your home, to search your property, to accuse you of hoarding untaxed salt without any evidence. And the punishments were they were barbaric. Getting caught could mean a massive fine, public whipping, or being sent to the galleys, basically a death sentence, chained to an oar on a warship. For repeat offenders, it was simply execution. Thousands of people a year, men, women, and even children, were imprisoned, enslaved, or killed, all for trying to get a cheaper price on a mineral they needed to survive. This wasn't just a tax anymore. This was a daily, grinding humiliation. It was the ultimate symbol of a system that was fundamentally unequal and unjust. It was a tax on life itself. And when the people of France finally had enough, when they drew up their lists of grievances for the Estates General in 1789, what do you think was right at the top of the list? Abolish the gabelle. It wasn't the only spark that lit the flame of the French Revolution, but it was one of the driest, most flammable piles of kindling imaginable, and the world of salt was about to change forever. So, as the French Revolution was exploding, driven in no small part by a salt tax that had become a symbol of royal tyranny, a brand new nation was just getting on its feet across the Atlantic. And that nation, the United States of America, was about to discover that its own continental destiny would be shaped by a very different, but equally powerful, salt story. It starts with a place the native Haudenosaunee people had known about for centuries, a place of salty springs and marshes near a lake they called Onondaga. To the early American settlers, this was the Great Salt Lick, and it wasn't just some local curiosity, it was the mother lode, a seemingly endless supply of high-quality salt right on the edge of the western frontier. Very quickly, a boom town grew up around these brine wells, a place that would become Syracuse, New York, also known, of course, as the Salt City. The salt from Syracuse wasn't just a local business, it became the economic engine for the entire state. And here's the thing. The Erie Canal, the single most important infrastructure project of 19th century America, wasn't built just to connect the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. It was built to connect the world to that salt. It was the crucial artery that allowed millions of barrels of cheap American-made salt to flow out to the coast, breaking the European import monopoly and fueling the country's westward expansion by making it possible to preserve food for the long journey. But America's story with salt wasn't just about building, it was also about breaking. Fast forward a few decades to the American Civil War. And you have the exact same problem that Roman generals had. How do you feed massive armies in the field? You can't rely on fresh food. You need preserved meat. And that means you need salt, a staggering amount of it. Suddenly, salt wasn't just a commodity. It was a strategic military asset, and it became a target. The Union Navy blockaded southern ports specifically to cut off salt imports. Union armies were sent on missions with the explicit goal of destroying Confederate salt works. And the response from the Confederacy was pure desperation. Both the Union and the Confederacy fought desperate, bloody battles to control a single swampy town in Appalachia, Saltville, Virginia. It was one of the South's only major domestic sources of salt. They were fighting over a salt marsh because they knew the war could be won or lost based on which side could pickle the most pork. Control the salt, and you control the other army's ability to eat. It was the Chinese gabelle and the Venetian trade wars, played out with rifles and cannons in the hills of Virginia. And so, with battles like Saltville, the ancient role of salt as a strategic weapon of war reached its bloody, brutal conclusion. For thousands of years, controlling salt meant controlling life itself. But in the decades following the American Civil War, something happened that no empire or army had ever managed to achieve. Technology finally broke salt's geopolitical power forever. First came the railroads, crisscrossing continents and connecting inland markets to new, massive salt deposits, shattering the local monopolies that had defined commerce for centuries. Then came industrial-scale mining and evaporation techniques that made salt ridiculously, almost absurdly, cheap and abundant. And then, finally, came the killing blow: mechanical refrigeration. Suddenly, you didn't need a barrel of salt to ship meat from Chicago to New York. You could just put it on a refrigerated boxcar. The ancient life-or-death power of preservation, the very thing that had allowed humans to conquer the globe, was now being handled by chemistry and machinery. Salt's imperial age was over. The gabelle, the salt roads, the Venetian fleets, they were all relics of a world that no longer existed. But salt didn't just disappear. Its power didn't vanish. It just changed shape. As its old job as the world's most important strategic commodity faded, it found a new one. Because when you have a substance that is incredibly cheap, makes food taste amazing, and acts as a fantastic preservative and processing aid, well, you start to put it in everything. And this is the pivot. This is the moment that brings us right back to the beginning of our story. The end of salt's military history marks the beginning of its industrial food history. Every single development we've talked about, the deep drilling in China, the industrial mining in Germany, the massive production in Syracuse, all of it laid the groundwork for the 20th century processed food explosion. The can of soup in your pantry, the frozen meal, the bag of chips, none of it would be possible without the cheap, ubiquitous salt that a century of industrialization had created. And so, we're back where we started, in our modern kitchen surrounded by salt, most of it completely invisible. The story of salt is the story of civilization in miniature. It begins as a biological necessity, a life-giving rock that our ancestors followed animals for miles to find. It becomes the key to our survival, the magic that lets us preserve food, cheat starvation, and populate the planet. Then, it becomes power. It becomes money in a Roman soldier's pouch. It becomes the foundation of the Chinese Empire, the wealth of Venice, and the misery of the French peasant. It's a force so powerful that we build great walls and fight revolutions over it. For 10,000 years, humanity's biggest problem with salt was not being able to get enough of it. And today, our problem is the exact opposite. The same mineral that once decided the fate of empires now decides the fate of our blood pressure. The power of salt hasn't gone away. It has just moved from the battlefield to our own bodies. It has become a hidden force, a biological power that shapes our health in ways we're only just beginning to understand. So the next time you pick up a salt shaker, just remember the journey that simple crystal has taken. It's a story of survival, of empire, of war, and of wealth. It's the most powerful substance in human history, and it's right there on your dinner table.